The hospital room felt like it was closing in on me as another contraction ripped through my body. The fluorescent lights above cast harsh shadows across the sterile walls of Cedar Grove Medical Center, and the steady beep of monitors filled the silence where my husband's voice should have been. I gripped the bed rails, my knuckles white as I fought through the pain, when my phone buzzed on the side table. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. At first, I thought it might be Marcus finally responding to my earlier messages. I had texted him 3 times in the past hour, each message more urgent than the last. The baby was coming faster than expected, and Dr. Foster had already warned me we were past the point of turning back. But when I managed to grab my phone with a trembling hand, what I saw made my blood freeze in a way that had nothing to do with the hospital's air conditioning. The message was longer than usual, formatted with the cold precision of a business email. As I read the words, each sentence felt like a physical blow. Marcus wasn't coming to the hospital. He wouldn't be holding my hand through labor. He wouldn't be there to see our child take their first breath. Instead, he had chosen this moment, while I was alone and vulnerable, to inform me that our marriage was over. Not through a phone call, not face-to-face, but through a text message that read like a legal document. The cruelest part wasn't even the timing, though that was devastating enough. It was the clinical way he outlined his reasons, as if he had rehearsed every word. He wrote about how our relationship had run its course, how he needed space to find himself, how this wasn't anyone's fault but sometimes people just grow apart. There was no mention of Isabella Cruz, though I knew she was the real reason behind his sudden need for self-discovery. There was no acknowledgement that I was currently bringing his child into the world. There was just cold, calculated dismissal wrapped in corporate speak. My name is Natalie Rivers. I'm 32 years old, and I built a successful digital marketing consultancy from nothing while supporting my husband's dreams of expanding his construction business. And this is the story of how the worst day of my life became the catalyst for the most empowering transformation I never knew I needed. Dr. Caroline Foster chose that exact moment to walk into the room, her experienced eyes immediately picking up on my distress. She had been my obstetrician for the past 7 months, and I had grown to trust her calm, steady presence. But even her professional composure couldn't hide the flash of concern that crossed her face when she saw me staring at my phone with tears streaming down my cheeks. "Natalie, sweetheart, what's wrong?" she asked, quickly moving to check my monitors. "Is it the pain? We can adjust your medication if you need us to." I couldn't speak at first. The words felt too surreal, too cruel to say out loud. How do you tell someone that your husband just divorced you via text message while you're in active labor with his child? How do you explain that the person who promised to love and support you through sickness and health has chosen your most vulnerable moment to abandon you completely? "He's not coming," I finally managed to whisper, my voice barely audible over the medical equipment. "Marcus isn't coming." Dr. Foster's expression softened with understanding. She had seen enough deliveries to know that sometimes partners didn't handle the stress well, that some men got overwhelmed and needed a moment to collect themselves. But something in my tone must have told her this was different, because she pulled up a chair beside my bed instead of moving on to her medical checks. "Tell me what happened," she said gently, and something about her steady presence broke through the shock that had been numbing me since I read that message. I handed her my phone, watching her face change as she read Marcus's text. Her professional composure cracked slightly, and I saw a flash of anger cross her features before she composed herself again. Dr. Foster had delivered hundreds of babies, had seen fathers faint, panic, and even run out of the room in fear, but I could tell she had never encountered anything quite like this. "Natalie, I am so sorry," she said, her voice carrying both sympathy and barely controlled outrage. "This is unconscionable timing, even if he was having doubts about your relationship." Another contraction hit me then, stronger than before, and I had to focus all my energy on breathing through it. But even as my body prepared to bring new life into the world, my mind was racing with questions and hurt and a growing sense of something I couldn't quite name yet. It felt like anger, but it was colder than that, more calculated. "The timing isn't coincidental," I heard myself saying as the contraction subsided. The words came out steadier than I expected, as if some part of me had already begun processing what this really meant. "He knew I'd be here, vulnerable and unable to confront him. He knew I wouldn't be able to demand explanations or fight back." Dr. Foster squeezed my hand. "Do you have someone else you can call? Family? Friends? You shouldn't have to go through this alone." I thought about Lauren, my best friend who would drop everything to drive across town if I asked. I thought about my parents, who lived 3 hours away but would probably break several speed limits to get here. But something held me back from making those calls immediately. Maybe it was pride, or maybe it was the strange sense of clarity that was beginning to cut through my shock. "Let me get through this first," I said, surprising myself with how calm I sounded. "Then I'll figure out what comes next." The next few hours passed in a blur of medical activity and emotional numbness. Foster and her team were incredible, providing not just medical care but emotional support that helped me focus on what my body needed to do. They never once made me feel pitied or broken, even though I was going through labor without the support I had expected and planned for. Between contractions, my mind kept circling back to Marcus's text message. I found myself analyzing every word, every phrase, looking for clues about when he had written it, when he had made this decision. The more I thought about it, the more calculated it seemed. This wasn't a moment of panic or overwhelming emotion. This was planned, strategic, designed to catch me when I was least able to respond or fight back. I thought about the past few months, searching for signs I might have missed. Marcus had been working longer hours, claiming that several big construction projects required his constant attention. He had been more distracted during conversations, always checking his phone, always having urgent calls that took him into another room. There had been unexplained charges on our joint credit card, restaurant bills for amounts that seemed too large for one person, but that he explained away as business dinners. Most telling of all, he had become increasingly distant about the pregnancy itself. Early on, he had seemed excited about becoming a father, talking about converting the spare room into a nursery and making plans for our growing family. But as my due date approached, he had withdrawn from those conversations, claiming stress about work and finances. Now I wondered if he had already been planning his exit strategy, waiting for the right moment to implement it. The realization hit me during a particularly intense contraction. Marcus hadn't just decided to leave me. He had orchestrated this entire situation to happen while I was at my most vulnerable, ensuring I would be too overwhelmed by labor to immediately fight back or demand explanations. It was strategic, calculated, and incredibly cruel. But as that understanding settled over me, something else began to take shape in my mind. If Marcus thought he was so clever, if he believed he had played this perfectly to his advantage, then he was in for a significant surprise. Because while he had been planning his betrayal, I had been building something much more substantial than he realized. My digital marketing consultancy wasn't just a small business anymore. Over the past 3 years, it had grown into something significant, with major clients and steady revenue streams. I had been careful to keep detailed financial records, to maintain separate business accounts, and to document every contribution I had made to our household income. Marcus had always been somewhat dismissive of my work, treating it like a hobby that happened to bring in some extra money, but the reality was that my business had been supporting both of us more than he acknowledged. Moreover, while Marcus had been focused on his construction projects and apparently his relationship with Isabella, I had been quietly taking care of all the details that kept our life running smoothly. I handled our taxes, managed our investments, maintained relationships with our insurance providers, and kept meticulous records of our financial situation. I knew exactly what we owned, what we owed, and what everything was worth. As I worked through another contraction, a strange sense of calm began to settle over me. Marcus clearly thought he had blindsided me, that he had chosen the perfect moment to catch me off guard, and unable to respond effectively. He probably expected me to be so overwhelmed by single motherhood, and the immediate crisis of his abandonment, that I wouldn't have the energy or resources to fight back against whatever settlement he proposed. But Marcus had made a crucial miscalculation. He had underestimated not just my strength, but my intelligence and my preparedness. And more importantly, he had chosen to reveal his true character at a moment that would be impossible for him to later explain away or minimize. Dr. Foster appeared at my bedside again, checking my progress and offering encouraging words about how well I was handling everything. "You're doing amazingly, Natalie," she said warmly. "Your baby is going to be born to an incredibly strong mother." "Doctor," I said, an idea forming in my mind. "I need to ask you about documentation. Medical records specifically about the timing of events today." She looked puzzled but nodded. "Everything is thoroughly documented, of course. Timestamps for when you arrived, when labor progressed, all medical decisions and procedures." Why do you ask? I just want to make sure everything is properly recorded, I said, not yet ready to explain the full scope of what I was thinking, including the fact that I was alone and why. Dr. Foster's expression grew more serious as she began to understand the implications. Natalie, if you're concerned about legal matters, I want you to know that our records will reflect exactly what happened here today. The medical team can provide testimony if needed about the circumstances of your delivery. I nodded, filing that information away for later consideration. Because even as I focused on bringing my child safely into the world, part of my mind was already several steps ahead, thinking about what would happen after we left this hospital room. Marcus had made his choice to abandon me in my moment of greatest need, and he had done it in the most cowardly and calculated way possible. He clearly believed he held all the cards, that he had successfully positioned himself for a clean break that would leave him free to start fresh with Isabella, while minimizing any inconvenience to himself. But Marcus had no idea what was coming. He had no understanding of how thoroughly he had just destroyed any sympathy or goodwill I might have extended to him in divorce proceedings. He had no clue that his strategic cruelty was about to become the foundation for consequences he never saw coming.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
As another contraction built, stronger and more intense than before, I felt something shifting inside me that had nothing to do with labor. It was a sense of purpose, of clarity about what needed to happen next. Marcus wanted to play games, to manipulate timing and circumstance to his advantage. He thought he was dealing with someone who would be too overwhelmed and emotional to respond strategically. He was about to learn just how wrong he could be. The baby was coming soon now, Dr. Foster confirmed, and despite everything that had happened, I felt a surge of excitement about meeting my child. This little person would be born into chaos and uncertainty, but they would also be born to a mother who was discovering just how much strength she possessed. Marcus had intended his text message to be the end of our story together, a final word that would leave me scrambling to pick up the pieces while he moved on to his new life. But what he had actually done was provide me with all the ammunition I would need to ensure that his betrayal would cost him far more than he had ever imagined. The worst day of my life was about to become the beginning of something much more powerful than Marcus could have anticipated. And tomorrow, when the immediate crisis of delivery was behind me, I would begin showing him exactly what happened when you underestimated Natalie Rivers. But first I had a baby to bring into the world, and despite everything else that was falling apart around me, that remained the most important thing. This child deserved to be born into love and hope, regardless of what their father had chosen to do. As I prepared for the final stages of labor, I made a silent promise to my unborn child, and to myself. We were going to be just fine. In fact, we were going to be better than fine. Because sometimes the worst betrayals clear the way for the best transformations, and Marcus had just given me the motivation I needed to become someone stronger than I had ever imagined possible. The first cry of my daughter pierced through the sterile air of the delivery room at 3:47 a.m., and for a moment everything else in the world disappeared. Dr. Foster placed the tiny perfect bundle on my chest, and I felt an overwhelming surge of love that temporarily pushed aside all the pain and betrayal of the past several hours. She was beautiful, with a shock of dark hair, and the strongest grip I had ever felt when her tiny fingers wrapped around mine. "She's absolutely perfect," Dr. Foster said softly, her voice filled with the kind of wonder that never seemed to fade, despite all the deliveries she had attended. 10 fingers, 10 toes, and clearly a fighter just like her mother. As I held my daughter for the first time, studying her perfect features and marveling at the miracle of her existence, my phone buzzed again on the bedside table. Part of me hoped irrationally that it might be Marcus, that perhaps seeing our child born would snap him back to his senses, make him realize what he was throwing away. But when I glanced at the screen, it wasn't my husband's name that appeared. The message was from Isabella Cruz, a name I recognized from Marcus's phone contacts, though we had never been formally introduced. Her text was brief but loaded with implications that made my blood run cold even as I cradled my newborn daughter. She was writing to inform me that she and Marcus were together, that they had been planning this transition for months, and that she hoped I would be reasonable about the divorce proceedings for everyone's sake, especially the baby's. The audacity of receiving relationship advice from my husband's mistress while I was still in the delivery room would have been laughable if it weren't so infuriating. But what struck me most was the coordinated nature of these messages. This wasn't spontaneous or emotional. Marcus and Isabella had clearly planned not just the timing of his departure, but the follow-up communication designed to manage my response and control the narrative. Dr. Foster noticed my expression change as I read the message. "More bad news?" she asked gently, though her tone suggested she was preparing for whatever fresh cruelty had just arrived. "His girlfriend wants to make sure I'm reasonable about the divorce," I said, my voice surprisingly steady despite the rage building inside me. "Apparently, they've been planning this transition for months." The look that crossed Dr. Foster's face was one of pure disgust. "In 30 years of delivering babies, I have never encountered such calculated cruelty," she said firmly. "What they're doing isn't just emotionally abusive, Natalie. The timing, the coordination, the deliberate vulnerability they're exploiting. This speaks to a level of premeditation that could have legal implications." As she spoke, something clicked into place in my mind. I had been thinking about Marcus's betrayal in emotional terms, focusing on the hurt and abandonment and cruelty of his timing. But Dr. Foster was right. This wasn't just a relationship ending badly. This was a coordinated campaign designed to leave me at maximum disadvantage during divorce proceedings. The more I thought about it, the more strategic their approach became clear. By leaving me during labor, Marcus ensured I would be physically and emotionally compromised during the most critical early days of divorce proceedings. He probably expected me to be overwhelmed by single motherhood, desperate for any kind of stability, and willing to accept whatever terms he offered just to avoid a prolonged legal battle. Isabella's message reinforced this strategy. By positioning herself as the reasonable voice encouraging cooperation, she was attempting to establish a narrative where any resistance from me would seem unreasonable or vindictive. They were trying to frame their months of planning and deception as a natural evolution that I should simply accept gracefully. But as I looked down at my daughter, sleeping peacefully in my arms despite all the chaos surrounding her birth, I felt something crystallizing inside me that had nothing to do with hurt feelings or emotional reaction. This was about protecting her, about ensuring that her father's selfish choices didn't damage her future opportunities or security. And that meant approaching this situation strategically rather than emotionally. "Dr. Foster," I said quietly, "I need to ask another favor. Could you document in your notes that I received these messages during my recovery? The timing and content might be relevant later." She nodded approvingly, already planned on it. "And Natalie, I want you to know that if this situation requires testimony about the circumstances of your delivery, the entire medical team here will support you. What happened today was unconscionable." Over the next several hours, as I focused on bonding with my daughter and learning the basics of newborn care, my phone continued to buzz with messages. Some were from Lauren and other friends who had heard the news and were offering support. Others were from Marcus's family members, and reading those gave me valuable insight into how this situation was being managed and controlled. Patricia Rivers, Marcus's mother, sent a message expressing disappointment that things had ended this way but hoping we could all move forward amicably for the baby's sake. Vincent Rivers, his father, was more direct, suggesting that sometimes marriages run their course and the important thing now was ensuring a smooth transition. But it was Stephanie Walsh, Marcus's sister, whose message revealed the most about their family's strategy. Stephanie wrote a long text explaining how difficult this decision had been for Marcus, how he had agonized over the timing but felt it was better to be honest rather than pretend everything was fine. She emphasized how much he cared about the baby and wanted to be a good father, even if he couldn't continue being a husband. She mentioned that the family had been concerned about our marriage for some time and hoped we could work out custody arrangements that would allow everyone to move forward positively. The message was crafted so carefully that I could practically see the family meeting where they had planned out their talking points. They were all staying on script, presenting a unified narrative that painted Marcus as reluctant but honest, themselves as supportive but neutral, and me as the variable that could either cooperate reasonably or make things difficult for everyone. What they didn't realize was that their coordinated messaging was actually providing me with valuable information about their strategy and expectations. They clearly believed they could control the narrative and my response through careful manipulation of timing and emotional pressure. They assumed I would be too overwhelmed by new motherhood to mount any kind of strategic response. But while they had been planning Marcus's exit strategy, I had been building something they didn't fully understand or appreciate. My digital marketing consultancy wasn't just successful, it was sophisticated. I had spent years developing relationships with clients who trusted my strategic thinking and problem-solving abilities. I understood how to analyze complex situations, identify key leverage points, and develop comprehensive response strategies. More importantly, I had been managing our family's financial affairs with the same methodical approach I brought to my business clients. I knew exactly what assets we owned individually and jointly. I had documentation of every contribution I had made to our shared expenses and investments. I had records of business decisions we had made together and financial commitments we had undertaken. While Marcus had been focused on his construction projects and his relationship with Isabella, I had been quietly ensuring that our family's financial foundation was solid and well documented. I had insisted on proper insurance policies, retirement planning, and legal protections that Marcus had often dismissed as unnecessary complexity. Now those same protective measures were going to become crucial tools in ensuring that his betrayal didn't damage my daughter's future security. Dr. Foster returned to check on us again, and I could see the concern in her eyes as she observed my thoughtful expression. How are you processing all of this, Natalie? It's important that you don't try to handle everything at once. The emotional trauma of what you've experienced could affect your recovery and your ability to bond with the baby. I'm actually feeling clearer than I expected, I told her honestly. The more I think about what happened, the more I realize this wasn't an emotional decision on Marcus's part. This was calculated and strategic, and if he wants to play strategic games, then I need to approach this strategically too. She sat down beside my bed, her expression growing more serious. What are you thinking? I'm thinking that Marcus made a crucial error in judgment. He assumed that I would be too overwhelmed and vulnerable to respond effectively. But what he actually did was remove any reason I might have had to protect his interests during divorce proceedings. He chose to abandon me at my most vulnerable moment, and he coordinated that abandonment with his girlfriend to maximize my disadvantage. Dr. Foster nodded slowly. And now you're going to respond accordingly. Now I'm going to protect my daughter's interests, which means ensuring that her father's selfish choices don't compromise her future opportunities. Marcus wanted to control the timing and circumstances of our separation to his advantage. But he just gave me all the documentation I need to ensure that his advantage becomes his biggest liability. Over the rest of that day, as I held my daughter and processed the magnitude of what had happened, I began mentally organizing my approach to what came next. The hurt and betrayal were still there, but they were being channeled into something more productive than grief. Marcus had thought he was dealing with someone who would be too emotional and overwhelmed to think strategically. He was about to discover how wrong he could be. My phone rang late that afternoon, and Lauren's name appeared on the screen. I had finally called her once I felt ready to explain what had happened, and she had been as outraged as I expected. "I'm in the car right now," she said without preamble. "Tell me what you need me to bring." "Actually, I need you to do something else first," I said, surprising myself with how calm and focused I sounded. "I need you to go to my office and retrieve some files. Specifically, all the documentation related to our joint investments and the business loans Marcus took out with my co-signature." There was a pause. "Natalie, are you sure you want to be thinking about legal strategy right now? You just gave birth, and you've been through massive emotional trauma. Maybe you should focus on recovering and bonding with the baby." Lauren, the timing of what Marcus did wasn't coincidental. He chose to divorce me while I was in labor specifically because he assumed I would be too overwhelmed to respond strategically. But all he actually did was remove any incentive I might have had to protect his interests. If he wants to play games with timing and strategy, then I need to be prepared to play those games better than he does. Another pause, longer this time. When Lauren spoke again, her voice carried a different tone, one that recognized the woman I was becoming rather than the woman I had been yesterday. "What files do you need me to get?" As I gave her specific instructions about which documents to retrieve and where to find them, I felt a sense of purpose that cut through all the emotional chaos of the past 24 hours. Marcus had made his choice, and now I was going to make mine. But unlike his choice, which was based on selfishness and cowardice, mine was going to be based on protecting my daughter's future and ensuring that his betrayal came with appropriate consequences. The next morning brought a new wave of messages, and reading them gave me even more insight into how Marcus and his family planned to manage this situation. His father sent a message about wanting to discuss custody arrangements that would work for everyone. His mother wrote about hoping we could maintain family relationships despite the marriage ending. Stephanie sent another carefully crafted message about the importance of putting the baby's needs first. But it was the message from Marcus himself that revealed the most about his expectations and assumptions. He wrote about wanting to do right by our daughter, about hoping we could work out arrangements that would allow him to be present in her life while giving us both the space we needed to heal. He mentioned wanting to discuss financial support and custody schedules, and he emphasized his hope that we could handle everything amicably without involving lawyers unnecessarily. The entire message was designed to position him as reasonable and cooperative, while subtly pressuring me to agree to informal arrangements that would avoid legal scrutiny of his behavior. He was banking on my being too overwhelmed by new motherhood to insist on formal legal proceedings that would expose the calculated nature of his abandonment. But what Marcus didn't understand was that his message had just provided me with crucial information about his strategy and his vulnerabilities. By emphasizing his desire to avoid lawyers and formal proceedings, he was revealing that he understood those proceedings might not go well for him. By positioning himself as cooperative and reasonable, he was acknowledging that his behavior could be seen as unreasonable by objective observers. Most importantly, by reaching out now to discuss arrangements, he was demonstrating that he expected me to be grateful for any involvement he was willing to offer. He clearly believed that his abandonment during labor had left me in such a desperate position that I would accept whatever terms he proposed rather than risk losing even his limited participation in our daughter's life. As I fed my daughter and watched her sleep peacefully in the hospital bassinet, I found myself smiling for the first time since receiving that devastating text message. Marcus thought he had played his cards perfectly, timing his departure to maximize my vulnerability and minimize my ability to respond effectively. He assumed that his strategic cruelty would leave me scrambling to accept whatever arrangement he was willing to offer. But Marcus had made a fundamental miscalculation about who he was dealing with. The woman he had abandoned in that labor room was someone who had built a successful business through careful planning and strategic thinking. She was someone who had spent years managing complex financial arrangements and client relationships. She was someone who understood how to analyze situations, identify leverage points, and develop comprehensive response strategies. And now she was someone who had absolutely no reason to protect his interests or consider his feelings when developing her own strategic response. Dr. Foster appeared for her final check before my discharge, and she seemed pleased with both my physical recovery and my emotional state. "You seem remarkably composed for someone who's been through what you've experienced," she observed. "I think I'm starting to understand that what happened wasn't the end of something." I told her it was the beginning of something else entirely. Marcus thought he was ending our story on his terms, but what he actually did was give me the motivation and freedom to write a much better ending. She smiled approvingly. "Your daughter is very lucky to have such a strong mother." As I prepared to leave the hospital with my daughter, I felt a sense of anticipation rather than dread about what came next. Marcus had chosen to reveal his true character at a moment when it would be impossible for him to later minimize or explain away. He had provided me with documentation of calculated cruelty that would be very difficult for him to defend in any legal proceeding. More importantly, he had freed me from any obligation to consider his feelings or protect his reputation when deciding how to respond. The woman who had been willing to support his dreams and protect his interests no longer existed. In her place was someone who understood exactly what kind of man she had been married to, and who was prepared to ensure that his betrayal came with appropriate consequences. The drive home from the hospital felt like a journey into a completely different life than the one I had been living just 48 hours earlier. But as I looked at my sleeping daughter in her car seat, I felt more hopeful about our future than I had felt in months. Marcus had thought he was ending our story, but he had actually just given me the plot twist I needed to write something much more empowering than what had come before. 3 weeks after bringing my daughter home, I was sitting in my living room reviewing financial documents when Lauren knocked on the door carrying coffee and the determined expression she wore when she had news to share. Emily was sleeping peacefully in her bassinet beside me, and I had been using her nap times to methodically organize everything I would need for the legal proceedings ahead. "You're going to want to sit down for this," Lauren said, settling into the chair across from me, with an unusual mix of excitement and concern on her face. "I've been doing some digging like you asked, and what I found is bigger than either of us expected." Over the past weeks, I had asked Lauren to help me investigate Marcus's recent business activities and financial movements. What started as a simple request to understand our joint assets had evolved into a comprehensive examination of his construction company and personal finances. Lauren worked in real estate development and had connections throughout Portland's construction industry, making her the perfect person to discreetly gather information about Marcus's business dealings. Remember how Marcus told you he needed those emergency loans 6 months ago for the Riverside project? Lauren began, pulling out a folder thick with documents. The ones you co-signed because he said the client payment was delayed and he needed bridge financing to keep his crew working. I nodded, remembering the stress of that period. Marcus had been genuinely worried about having to lay off workers, and I had agreed to co-sign the loans without hesitation because I believed we were protecting his employees and our family's financial stability. The amount had been substantial, but Marcus had assured me it was temporary and that the client payment would resolve everything within weeks. Well, I found out something interesting about that client payment, Lauren continued, her voice growing more serious. It wasn't delayed. It was never coming at all because there was no legitimate client. Marcus created a shell company to generate fake invoices and project documentation to justify those loans. The words hit me like a physical blow. I had suspected that Marcus might have been hiding some assets or income to position himself advantageously for divorce proceedings, but this was something entirely different. This was fraud, committed using my credit and financial backing, which meant I wasn't just a victim of his deception but potentially liable for the consequences. There's more, Lauren said gently, clearly recognizing the shock on my face. The Riverside project exists, but it's not what Marcus told you. It's a residential development that he's building in partnership with Isabella's family. Her father owns the land, and they've been planning this joint venture for over a year. As the implications of what she was telling me began to sink in, I felt a cold fury building that was different from anything I had experienced before. Marcus hadn't just been planning to leave me. He had been systematically defrauding our joint financial accounts to fund a business venture with his girlfriend's family, using my creditworthiness and co-signature to secure financing for their shared future. How much money are we talking about? I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to hear the answer. Between the direct loans you co-signed and the credit lines he opened using your joint assets as collateral, he's moved almost $400,000 into this project. Lauren said quietly. And based on the development timeline, they've been planning this for at least 18 months, probably longer. The scope of the betrayal was staggering. While I had been supporting Marcus emotionally and financially, believing we were building a future together, he had been systematically transferring our shared resources to fund a life with Isabella. The loans I had co-signed, thinking I was helping him through a temporary crisis, were actually financing the construction of their shared business venture. Even worse, the timing meant that Marcus had been planning his departure long before I became pregnant. He had been moving money and establishing his new business partnership while I was carrying his child, all while maintaining the pretense of being a committed husband preparing for fatherhood. Lauren, this changes everything, I said, my mind already racing through the legal implications. This isn't just divorce fraud, this is systematic financial fraud that's been ongoing for over a year. And he used my signature and credit to do it. That's what I was thinking too, she agreed. But there's something else you need to know. I reached out to some contacts in the banking industry to understand how these loans were structured, and I discovered that Marcus has been making the minimum payments to keep everything current. Technically, you're not in default or immediate financial danger. He's been paying the minimums to keep me from discovering what he did, I realized. If the accounts had gone into default, I would have been notified immediately and started investigating. He needed to keep everything looking normal until after the divorce was finalized, and he could claim the development project as his separate property. Lauren nodded approvingly. Exactly, and that tells us something important about his timeline. He needs to keep those loans current until he can legally separate his financial obligations from yours. Which means he's probably hoping for a quick, amicable divorce settlement that doesn't involve detailed financial discovery. As we talked through the implications, I began to understand the full scope of Marcus's strategy. By leaving me during labor, he had hoped to create such emotional chaos that I would be willing to accept a simple settlement just to avoid prolonged conflict. His family's coordinated messages, emphasizing cooperation and putting the baby first, were designed to pressure me into avoiding the kind of detailed financial investigation that would expose his fraud. Isabella's involvement made the betrayal even more calculated. She wasn't just his girlfriend, she was his business partner in a venture funded by money he had stolen from our marriage. Her message about being reasonable during divorce proceedings wasn't concern for my well-being. It was protection of their joint investment. "I need to call Thomas Bradley immediately," I said, referring to the divorce attorney I had consulted during my pregnancy when I first suspected Marcus might be having an affair. "This information completely changes our legal strategy." Thomas had initially advised me to document Marcus's behavior and gather evidence of infidelity, but to avoid taking any dramatic action until after the baby was born. He had suggested that Oregon's no-fault divorce laws meant that proving adultery wouldn't significantly impact financial settlements, so my focus should be on ensuring favorable custody arrangements and protecting my business assets. But financial fraud was an entirely different matter. If Marcus had used marital assets and my credit to fund a business venture with his girlfriend, that could constitute both criminal fraud and a violation of his fiduciary duties as a spouse. More importantly, it could provide grounds for recovering the money he had diverted and potentially claiming a portion of the development project he had funded with our resources. Emily stirred in her bassinet, and I reached down to stroke her tiny hand while my mind processed this new information. Marcus had thought he was so clever, planning every detail of his exit strategy to ensure maximum advantage for himself and Isabella. But his elaborate deception had actually created a paper trail that could be used to hold him accountable for far more than simple adultery. "There's one more thing," Lauren said, her voice growing even more serious. "When I was researching the development project, I discovered that Marcus has been telling people in the industry that you knew about his partnership with Isabella's family. He's been positioning the narrative as if this was a joint family business venture that you supported. The audacity of that lie was breathtaking. Not only had Marcus stolen our money to fund his relationship with Isabella, but he was actively spreading false information to make it appear as if I had been a willing participant in their business venture. This suggested that his exit strategy included not just taking our money, but potentially claiming that I had been complicit in or supportive of his relationship with Isabella. He's trying to rewrite history," I said, the full picture finally becoming clear. "If he can convince people that I knew about and supported his business relationship with Isabella, then he can argue that our separation was mutual and that I have no claim to the development project." "That's exactly what I was thinking," Lauren confirmed. "And it gets worse. Based on what people are saying in the industry, Marcus has been telling this story for months. He's been building a narrative that makes you look like either a willing participant in his affair, or someone who was too focused on your own business to pay attention to what was happening in your marriage." The systematic nature of Marcus's deception was becoming clear. This wasn't a man who had fallen in love and made impulsive decisions. This was someone who had spent over a year carefully constructing a narrative that would allow him to abandon his family while keeping the money he had stolen and avoiding responsibility for his choices. But as I sat there holding my daughter and processing the magnitude of what Marcus had done, I felt something unexpected relief. For months I had been doubting my own perceptions, wondering if I was being paranoid or oversensitive about Marcus's behavior. I had questioned whether his increasing distance was normal stress about becoming a father, whether his secretiveness about work was just professional discretion. Now I knew that my instincts had been correct all along. Marcus hadn't just been pulling away emotionally, he had been systematically dismantling our marriage while constructing a new life with Isabella. Every strange charge on our credit cards, every unexplained absence, every dismissive comment about my concerns had been part of a calculated campaign to steal our money and escape our marriage without consequences. "Lauren, I need you to help me with something else," I said, my voice growing stronger as I began to formulate a plan. "I want you to reach out to your contacts in the development industry and find out everything you can about this project. Timeline, financing, permits, construction schedule, everything. If Marcus has been telling people I was involved, then I want to know exactly what story he's been spreading." "Already on it," she said with a grim smile. "But Natalie, you should know that pursuing this could get messy. Financial fraud cases can take years to resolve, and Marcus clearly has resources and legal counsel. Are you prepared for that kind of fight?" I looked down at Emily, sleeping peacefully despite all the chaos surrounding her young life. Marcus had made his choice to prioritize his relationship with Isabella over his responsibilities to his daughter. He had chosen to steal our money to fund their future together, rather than ensuring his child's financial security. He had chosen to abandon us at our most vulnerable moment, rather than fulfilling his obligations as a husband and father. He made this choice when he decided to fund his affair with our money, I said firmly. Emily deserves to have her father held accountable for stealing from her future. And I deserve to recover what he took from us. Over the next few days, as Lauren continued gathering information about Marcus's business activities, I began working with Thomas Bradley to understand our legal options. The discovery of the fraudulent loans and hidden business partnership had transformed our case from a simple divorce with custody issues into a complex financial fraud investigation with potential criminal implications. Thomas was initially cautious about pursuing the fraud angle, warning me that proving intentional deception could be difficult and expensive. But as he reviewed the documentation Lauren had gathered, his attitude shifted dramatically. "Natalie, this is one of the most clear-cut cases of marital financial fraud I've seen in 20 years of practice," he told me during our meeting. "The paper trail Marcus created while establishing this business partnership provides almost everything we need to prove he was systematically diverting marital assets for personal benefit. What kind of recovery are we looking at?" I asked, though I was more interested in accountability than money at this point. "Potentially all of it, plus damages," Thomas said, his professional excitement evident. "Oregon law is very clear about spouses who use marital assets for personal benefit without consent. The fact that he used your credit and signature to secure funding makes this even stronger. We could potentially claim not just the money he diverted, but a portion of the development project itself." The idea that Marcus's elaborate deception could result in me becoming a partner in the business venture he had built with Isabella was deeply satisfying. He had assumed that his careful planning and strategic timing would leave me too overwhelmed to fight back effectively. Instead, his own documentation was about to become the foundation for legal consequences he had never anticipated. "There's something else you should consider," Thomas continued. "Given the scope and duration of this fraud, we could argue that Marcus's behavior demonstrates such fundamental dishonesty that it should impact custody arrangements. A man who would steal from his own family and lie about it for over a year might not be the kind of father who should have unsupervised access to a child." That possibility hadn't occurred to me, but it made perfect sense. Marcus's willingness to defraud his pregnant wife to fund his affair demonstrated a level of selfishness and dishonesty that could be relevant to his fitness as a parent. Emily deserved better than a father who would prioritize his own desires over her security and well-being. As I drove home from Thomas's office, I felt a sense of anticipation that was entirely different from the dread and uncertainty I had been experiencing since Marcus's abandonment. He had thought he was playing a game where he held all the advantages, where his strategic timing and careful planning would leave me defenseless. But Marcus had made a crucial miscalculation. He had assumed that I would be too emotional and overwhelmed to think strategically about his behavior. He had believed that his coordinated campaign with Isabella and his family would pressure me into accepting whatever settlement they offered rather than fighting back. Instead, his elaborate deception had provided me with all the evidence I needed to hold him accountable not just for abandoning his family, but for the systematic fraud he had committed to fund his new life. The man who had texted me divorce papers while I was in labor was about to discover that his strategic cruelty had created consequences he never saw coming. Emily was growing stronger every day, and as I watched her sleep peacefully in her crib, I made a silent promise that her father's selfishness wouldn't define her future. Marcus had made his choice to prioritize Isabella over his family, and now he was going to learn exactly what that choice was going to cost him. The conference room at Bradley and Associates felt like neutral territory, its polished mahogany table and floor-to-ceiling windows creating an atmosphere of serious business that matched the gravity of what we were about to discuss. I arrived early, wanting to settle Emily in her carrier and review my notes one final time before Marcus and his legal team arrived. Thomas had arranged for a mediator to facilitate our discussion, though both sides understood this was likely our only opportunity to resolve things outside of formal litigation. Marcus walked in exactly on time, accompanied by his attorney Sandra Chen, and to my surprise, Vincent Rivers. His father's presence suggested that the family construction business was more involved in this situation than I had initially realized. Marcus looked tired, older somehow, and he avoided making eye contact with me as he took his seat across the table. He glanced at Emily sleeping peacefully in her carrier, and for just a moment something resembling regret crossed his features. "Thank you all for coming," the mediator began. "Mrs. Rivers has requested this meeting to discuss financial disclosures related to marital assets before proceeding with formal divorce proceedings. Mr. Rivers, I understand you have some concerns about the scope of financial discovery being requested." Sandra Chen spoke for Marcus, her tone professional but defensive. Our client believes that Mrs. Rivers is attempting to unnecessarily complicate what should be a straightforward dissolution of marriage. Mr. Rivers has been transparent about his assets and income, and he's prepared to offer generous child support and reasonable property division. Thomas opened the folder in front of him with deliberate precision. I think we need to clarify what transparency means in this context, he said calmly. Mrs. Rivers has discovered some financial activities that weren't disclosed during initial proceedings, and we'd like to give Mr. Rivers an opportunity to explain them before we file formal fraud charges. The phrase fraud charges hung in the air like a thunderclap. Marcus's head snapped up, and for the first time since entering the room, he looked directly at me. The shock and panic in his eyes told me he hadn't expected this level of investigation into his financial activities. That's a very serious accusation, Sandra said, though uncertainty had crept into her voice. What specific activities are you referring to? Thomas slid a stack of documents across the table. Let's start with the Riverside Development Project. Mr. Rivers, can you explain how you funded your investment in this venture? I watched Marcus's face carefully as he examined the paperwork. The color drained from his cheeks as he recognized bank statements, loan applications, and corporate filings that detailed his financial activities over the past 18 months. Vincent shifted uncomfortably beside him, clearly recognizing the implications of what was being presented. I used legitimate business loans, Marcus said finally, his voice lacking conviction. Everything was properly documented. That's interesting, Thomas replied, producing another set of documents. Because according to these loan applications, you listed the funds as being for operational expenses related to existing construction contracts. But our investigation shows that 90% of these funds were transferred directly to the Riverside Development Partnership within days of being dispersed. Sandra began examining the documents more carefully, and I could see her professional composure starting to crack as she realized the scope of what Thomas was presenting. She had clearly expected to negotiate child support and property division, not defend against documented evidence of systematic financial fraud. Furthermore, Thomas continued, Mrs. Rivers co-signed these loans based on representations that they were temporary bridge financing for existing projects. Mr. Rivers, did you inform your wife that these funds would actually be used to establish a business partnership with Isabella Cruz and her family? The silence that followed was absolute. Marcus stared at the documents as if willing them to disappear, while Vincent looked increasingly uncomfortable with each revelation. I had been dreading this confrontation for weeks, but watching Marcus realize how thoroughly his deception had been exposed gave me a sense of vindication I hadn't expected. I think we need to take a recess, Sandra said, clearly needing time to absorb the implications of what had just been presented. This is the first time my client is seeing some of this documentation. Actually, that's not quite accurate, I said, speaking for the first time since the meeting began. My voice was steadier than I had expected, carrying none of the emotion I had felt during those first devastating days after Marcus's abandonment. Marcus has been making payments on these loans for months. He's been very careful to keep everything current so I wouldn't receive default notices that might lead me to investigate. Marcus finally looked at me directly, and what I saw in his expression was a mixture of shock, fear, and something that might have been grudging respect. He was beginning to understand that the woman he had abandoned in that hospital room was not the same person sitting across from him now. The payments prove knowledge and intent, Thomas explained to Sandra. Your client wasn't just careless with marital funds. He systematically diverted nearly $400,000 in jointly secured loans to fund a business venture with his romantic partner, then carefully maintained those accounts to avoid detection. Vincent spoke for the first time, his voice carrying the weight of someone who understood the broader implications of what was being discussed. What exactly are you proposing as resolution? Thomas smiled grimly. Mrs. Rivers is prepared to be reasonable, but she needs to be made whole for the financial damages caused by your son's deception. We're proposing that Mr. Rivers transfer his interest in the Riverside Development Project to Mrs. Rivers as compensation for the marital funds he diverted without consent. The suggestion hit the room like a physical blow. Marcus's carefully planned business venture with Isabella, funded by money stolen from our marriage, would become my property instead. The poetic justice of that outcome was not lost on anyone present. That's completely unreasonable, Sandra protested. The development project is worth significantly more than the loans in question. Perhaps Thomas acknowledged. But it was funded entirely with marital assets that were obtained through fraudulent representations to Mrs. Rivers. Under Oregon law, she's entitled to recover not just the principal amount, but damages for the deception and lost opportunity costs. As they debated the legal merits of our proposal, I found myself studying Marcus with a detachment that surprised me. This man had shared my bed for 8 years, had made promises about our future together, had been present when I first felt our daughter move inside me. But watching him struggle to defend his systematic betrayal, I realized that I had never really known him at all. The Marcus I had married wouldn't have been capable of the elaborate deception that had been revealed over the past weeks. That man had been considerate, honest, and committed to building something lasting together. But perhaps that version of Marcus had been as much of a fiction as the business emergency that had justified those fraudulent loans. There's another issue we need to address, Thomas said, drawing everyone's attention back to the legal proceedings. Mrs. Rivers is concerned about custody arrangements given the evidence of sustained deception and financial manipulation. Sandra's expression grew more defensive. Mr. Rivers' business decisions have no bearing on his fitness as a father. Actually, they do, I said quietly. A man who would steal from his pregnant wife to fund his affair demonstrates a level of selfishness and dishonesty that's relevant to his character. Emily deserves better than a father who would prioritize his relationship with another woman over her financial security. Marcus finally found his voice, though it came out strained and uncertain. Natalie, I never intended for any of this to hurt Emily. I love her and I want to be part of her life. You showed how much you love her when you abandoned us in the hospital to start your new life with Isabella, I replied, my voice remaining calm despite the anger underlying my words. You showed your priorities when you stole money from her college fund to build a business with your girlfriend's family. The truth of those statements hung in the air, impossible to deny or minimize. Marcus had made his choices, and now he was facing the consequences of those decisions in a way he had never anticipated. Vincent cleared his throat, clearly uncomfortable with the direction the conversation was taking. What would you consider reasonable custody arrangements? Thomas consulted his notes. Given Mr. Rivers' demonstrated willingness to prioritize his romantic relationship over his family's well-being, Mrs. Rivers proposes supervised visitation until Emily is old enough to communicate effectively about her experiences. The suggestion that Marcus would need supervision to spend time with his own daughter was clearly devastating to him. I could see him struggling with the reality that his actions had consequences beyond simple financial settlements, that his choices had fundamentally altered his relationship with his child. This is vindictive, Sandra protested. You're using the child as leverage in a financial dispute. No, I said firmly. I'm protecting my daughter from a man who has demonstrated that he's willing to lie, steal, and abandon his family when it serves his interests. Emily's safety and well-being are more important than Marcus's convenience. As the mediation continued, it became clear that we were not going to reach a settlement that day. The scope of Marcus's deception was too extensive, and the proposed consequences too severe, for his legal team to accept without extensive consideration. But I could see that the dynamic had shifted fundamentally from what Marcus had expected when he first reached out about amicable arrangements. He had clearly anticipated negotiating child support payments and visitation schedules with a woman too overwhelmed by single motherhood to fight effectively. Instead, he was facing documented evidence of systematic fraud and proposals that would cost him both his business venture and unsupervised access to his daughter. During a brief recess, Marcus approached me while our attorneys conferred in the hallway. Natalie, I know you're angry, and you have every right to be. But please don't use Emily as a weapon against me. I looked at him steadily, this man who had once been my closest companion and was now essentially a stranger. I'm not using Emily as a weapon, Marcus. I'm protecting her from someone who has proven that he's willing to prioritize his own desires over her well-being. I made mistakes, he said, his voice carrying desperation I had never heard before. But I never stopped loving her. You showed your love when you texted me divorce papers while I was in labor, I replied. You demonstrated your commitment to her future when you stole $400,000 to fund your relationship with Isabella. Actions matter more than words. Marcus, and your actions have been very clear. When the mediation resumed, Sandra requested time to review all the documentation and consult with additional experts about the financial implications of our proposals. Thomas agreed to a 2-week continuance, but made it clear that if we couldn't reach a settlement, we would proceed with formal litigation that would include criminal fraud referrals. As we prepared to leave, Marcus made one final attempt to appeal to whatever sympathy I might still harbor for him. The timing of everything was terrible, I know that, but I never meant for things to happen this way. I paused at the door, Emily's carrier in my hand, and turned back to face him one last time. You planned this for 18 months, Marcus. You created fake companies, forged documents, and systematically stole our money to fund your new life with Isabella. The only thing you didn't plan for was getting caught. The drive home felt different than I had expected. Instead of the emotional exhaustion I had anticipated, I felt energized by finally confronting the man who had betrayed me so thoroughly. For weeks, I had been building my case and gathering evidence, but seeing Marcus forced to face the scope of his deception had been deeply satisfying. Lauren was waiting at my house when I arrived, eager to hear how the mediation had gone. As I recounted the day's events, I could see her satisfaction growing with each detail about Marcus's obvious shock and panic. "Did you see this coming when you first started investigating?" she asked. "I knew he was hiding something, but I never imagined the scope of what he had done," I admitted. "Part of me almost feels sorry for him. He clearly never expected to be held accountable for any of this." "Don't you dare feel sorry for him," Lauren said firmly. "He made calculated decisions to betray you and steal from your family. The fact that he didn't think he'd get caught just makes it worse." That evening, as I fed Emily and reflected on everything that had happened, I realized that Marcus had given me something unexpected through his betrayal. He had forced me to discover strengths I didn't know I possessed, to develop skills I had never needed before, and to become someone more capable and independent than I had ever imagined possible. The woman who had trusted him completely, who had co-signed loans without question, and believed his explanations without investigation, no longer existed. In her place was someone who understood the importance of documentation, verification, and protecting herself and her daughter from people who would prioritize their own interests over family obligations. Marcus had thought he was ending our story with that text message in the labor room. But what he had actually done was begin a new chapter where I was the author, where his deception became the foundation for consequences he never anticipated, and where his betrayal became the catalyst for my transformation into someone much stronger than he had ever given me credit for being. 2 weeks from now, we would reconvene to hear his response to our proposals, but regardless of what he decided, I knew that the worst was behind me. Marcus had played his hand completely, revealing the full scope of his deception and selfishness. Now it was my turn to show him exactly what happened when someone underestimated Natalie Rivers. 6 months later, I stood on the balcony of my new penthouse apartment in Portland's Pearl District, watching the sunrise paint the city skyline in shades of gold and pink. Emily was babbling happily in her bouncy seat beside me, her chubby hands reaching for the colorful mobile that hung within her grasp. The view from the 42nd floor was spectacular, but what satisfied me most was knowing that this apartment was purchased entirely with funds recovered from Marcus's fraudulent business venture. The settlement negotiations had concluded 3 months after our confrontational mediation session. Marcus's legal team had initially tried to fight our proposals, but the evidence Thomas had assembled proved overwhelming. When the Oregon State Attorney's Office opened a criminal investigation into the fraudulent loan applications, Marcus's position became untenable. Rather than face potential criminal charges, he had agreed to transfer his entire interest in the Riverside Development Project to me, along with paying substantial damages for the emotional distress and financial manipulation. Isabella had initially tried to contest the settlement, claiming that her family's land contribution to the development project protected their interests. But Thomas had uncovered evidence that she had been involved in creating the false documentation used to secure the fraudulent loans, making her complicit in the scheme rather than an innocent victim. Faced with potential criminal liability herself, she had agreed to sell her family's land holdings to me at below market rates as part of the comprehensive settlement. The irony was delicious. Marcus and Isabella had spent 18 months carefully planning a business venture that would secure their financial future together. Instead, their elaborate deception had resulted in me becoming the sole owner of a multi-million-dollar development project, while they faced ongoing legal restrictions and substantial debt obligations. Marcus's construction company had nearly collapsed under the weight of the scandal. Word had spread quickly through Portland's tight-knit development community about the fraudulent loans and deceptive business practices. Several major clients had terminated contracts, and his company's bonding capacity had been severely restricted after insurance companies learned about the criminal investigation. Vincent had been forced to mortgage the family home to keep the business operational, and even then, they were operating on a skeleton crew. But the most satisfying outcome had been the custody arrangements. The family court judge had been appalled by the evidence of Marcus's calculated abandonment during labor and systematic financial deception. She had agreed that supervised visitation was appropriate until Emily reached school age, and that all visits would take place at a neutral facility with trained monitors present. Marcus was required to complete parenting classes and financial responsibility counseling before his visitation rights could be expanded. Emily stirred in her bouncy seat, making the soft cooing sounds that never failed to melt my heart. At 6 months old, she was already showing signs of the strong personality that would serve her well in life. She was curious, determined, and remarkably resilient, adapting easily to our new environment and routine. Sometimes I wondered if she sensed the chaos that had surrounded her birth, but she seemed remarkably content and secure in our new life together. My phone buzzed with a text from Lauren, who had become not just my closest friend but also my business partner in managing the Riverside Development Project. She had left her real estate position to help me navigate the complex world of commercial development, and together we had transformed what had been Marcus and Isabella's dream project into something even more ambitious and profitable. Board meeting in an hour, her message read. The investor presentations look amazing. You're going to love what the architects did with your suggestions. The Riverside development had evolved far beyond Marcus's original vision. Instead of the basic residential units he had planned, we were creating an innovative mixed-use community that incorporated affordable housing, commercial spaces, and environmental sustainability features. The project had attracted attention from urban planning experts and sustainable development advocates, bringing in investors and partners that Marcus never could have imagined accessing. More importantly, we had structured the development to include a significant affordable housing component, ensuring that families like the one I had once been would have opportunities for home ownership in Portland's competitive market. Every time I visited the construction site and saw the progress being made, I felt a deep satisfaction knowing that Marcus's betrayal had ultimately created something beneficial for the broader community. My phone rang, and Thomas Bradley's name appeared on the screen. Our business relationship had evolved into genuine friendship over the months of working together, and he had become not just my attorney but a trusted advisor for both legal and personal matters. "Good morning, Natalie," he said warmly. "I have some news you're going to want to hear. Remember that criminal referral we filed against Marcus for the fraudulent loan applications?" "Of course," I replied, settling into the comfortable chair on my balcony while keeping one eye on Emily. "Has there been a development? The prosecutor's office just called. Marcus has agreed to plead guilty to felony fraud charges in exchange for 3 years probation and full restitution to the affected financial institutions. He'll also be required to perform community service and undergo financial counseling." The news should have felt more satisfying than it did. Marcus would now have a criminal record that would follow him for the rest of his life, making it difficult for him to secure business loans or professional licenses. But mostly I felt a sense of closure rather than vindictive pleasure. The legal system had acknowledged what he had done and imposed appropriate consequences. Justice had been served, even if it couldn't undo the pain he had caused. "There's something else," Thomas continued. "Isabella Cruz was also charged as an accomplice. She's agreed to similar terms, but she'll also be prohibited from working in real estate or construction for 5 years. That information was more meaningful to me than Marcus's conviction. Isabella had been an active participant in the deception, helping to create false documentation and benefiting directly from the stolen funds. Her professional consequences seemed appropriate given her role in the scheme. After ending the call with Thomas, I found myself reflecting on how dramatically my life had changed since that devastating night in the hospital. The woman who had trusted blindly and supported unconditionally no longer existed. In her place was someone who verified everything, documented important decisions, and maintained protective barriers even in close relationships. But the transformation hadn't made me cynical or bitter. Instead, it had made me more intentional about the people I allowed into my life, and more careful about the ways I invested my emotional energy. I had learned to distinguish between healthy vulnerability and dangerous naivety, between generous support and enabling destructive behavior. Emily began fussing slightly, indicating that it was time for her morning feeding. As I prepared her bottle and settled into our comfortable routine, I thought about the lessons I wanted to teach her as she grew up. She would learn to be strong and independent, to trust her instincts, and to never allow anyone to diminish her worth or potential. But she would also learn about compassion, forgiveness, and the importance of building meaningful connections with people who deserved her trust. Marcus had requested additional visitation time twice since the original custody order was established, but both requests had been denied due to his failure to complete the required counseling programs. His attorney had suggested that the restrictions were excessive given that he posed no physical danger to Emily, but the court had maintained that emotional and financial reliability were just as important as physical safety when determining a parent's fitness. I had no intention of permanently denying Marcus access to his daughter, but I was determined to ensure that when he did have time with her, he was genuinely prepared to prioritize her well-being over his own convenience. The supervised visitation requirement would remain in place until he demonstrated consistent responsibility and emotional maturity over an extended period. Lauren arrived at my apartment an hour later, carrying her laptop and a folder full of architectural renderings for our investor presentation. The Riverside development had attracted interest from several major investment firms, and we were preparing to close on additional funding that would allow us to expand the project beyond our original scope. "You need to see these updated profit projections," she said excitedly, spreading the documents across my dining room table. "If we can secure this additional funding, we're looking at returns that are almost double what Marcus originally estimated." The numbers were impressive, but what excited me more was the social impact component of our development plan. We had partnered with local nonprofits to ensure that 20% of the housing units would be available to first-time homebuyers at below-market rates. Additionally, the commercial spaces would include subsidized retail opportunities for local entrepreneurs and small business owners. It's amazing how much more ambitious we could be once we removed Marcus's limitations. Lauren observed, "He was thinking like a small-time contractor trying to maximize quick profits. We're thinking like community developers trying to create something lasting." As we reviewed the presentation materials, Emily played contentedly in her portable playpen, occasionally making sounds that seemed to indicate approval of our business discussions. She had become accustomed to accompanying me to meetings and site visits, and the development team had embraced her as an unofficial mascot for the project. My phone buzzed with an unexpected message from Stephanie Walsh, Marcus's sister. We hadn't communicated since the early days after Emily's birth, when she had been part of the family's coordinated campaign to pressure me into accepting a quick settlement. Her message was brief but surprising. "Natalie, I wanted you to know that I understand now what Marcus did to you. I'm ashamed that our family didn't see it sooner. Emily is lucky to have such a strong mother." The message was unexpected but meaningful. Stephanie had been one of Marcus's most vocal supporters during the divorce proceedings, arguing that family loyalty required supporting him regardless of his choices. Learning that she had changed her perspective suggested that the full scope of his deception had finally become clear to his family members. I chose not to respond immediately, but I appreciated her acknowledgement of what had happened. The Rivers family had been complicit in Marcus's attempts to manipulate the divorce proceedings, but I recognized that they had been operating with incomplete information about his financial activities. Discovering that their son and brother had been systematically defrauding his pregnant wife had probably been as shocking to them as it had been to me. The investor presentation went exceptionally well. The firm's senior partners were impressed not just with our financial projections but with the innovative community development model we had created. By the end of the meeting, we had secured commitments for the additional funding we needed, along with expressions of interest in partnering with us on future projects. Walking out of that boardroom, I felt a profound sense of accomplishment that had nothing to do with revenge or vindication. Marcus's betrayal had forced me to discover capabilities I never knew I possessed, to develop skills I had never needed before, and to envision possibilities I had never considered. What had begun as a strategy to recover stolen funds had evolved into a career that was more fulfilling and impactful than anything I had previously imagined. That evening, I received an unexpected phone call from Dr. Foster, who had been following my situation since Emily's birth. She had heard about the development project through mutual acquaintances and wanted to congratulate me on the positive direction my life had taken. "I have to admit, when I saw what Marcus did to you in that labor room, I was deeply concerned about how you would cope with single motherhood and the emotional trauma," she said. "But watching what you've accomplished since then has been truly inspiring." "It's strange," I told her. "Sometimes I almost feel grateful for what happened. Not for the pain or betrayal, but for the way it forced me to become someone stronger than I ever thought possible." "That's the mark of true resilience," Dr. Foster replied. "The ability to transform adversity into growth and opportunity. Emily is very fortunate to have you as her mother." After ending the call, I found myself thinking about the woman I had been in that hospital room 6 months ago. She had been trusting, supportive, and completely unprepared for the level of betrayal she was experiencing. But she had also possessed an inner strength that had carried her through the darkest moments and provided the foundation for everything that came afterward. Marcus had intended his text message to be the final word in our relationship, a strategic move that would leave me overwhelmed and defenseless while he moved on to his new life with Isabella. But what he had actually done was provide me with the motivation and freedom to become someone more powerful and accomplished than he had ever given me credit for being. The development project was just the beginning. Lauren and I were already discussing plans for additional community-focused ventures, including affordable housing initiatives and small business incubation programs. The success of our first project had opened doors to opportunities that extended far beyond real estate development into comprehensive community transformation. Emily was thriving in our new environment, surrounded by people who celebrated her achievements and supported her development. She would grow up knowing that her mother had faced significant challenges and responded by building something meaningful and lasting. She would understand that setbacks could become comebacks, that betrayal could lead to empowerment, and that the people who underestimate you often provide the greatest motivation for proving them wrong. Marcus continued to struggle with the consequences of his choices. His construction company had been forced to file for bankruptcy protection, and he was working as a subcontractor for other firms while trying to rebuild his professional reputation. The criminal conviction had made it difficult for him to secure bonding for major projects, limiting his ability to compete for the kind of work that had once sustained his business. Isabella had moved back to California to live with her parents while serving her probation. The real estate restrictions had effectively ended her career in Portland, and the financial restitution requirements had consumed most of her savings. Their relationship had not survived the legal and financial pressures that followed the exposure of their fraud scheme. But I felt no particular satisfaction in their struggles. Their consequences were the natural result of their choices, just as my success was the result of the choices I had made in response to their betrayal. The best revenge, I had learned, wasn't about making them suffer. It was about building a life so fulfilling and meaningful that their actions became irrelevant to my happiness. As I tucked Emily into her crib that night, I whispered the same promise I had made to her in that hospital room 6 months ago. We were going to be just fine. In fact, we were going to be extraordinary. Because sometimes the worst betrayals clear the path for the best transformations, and Marcus had given me the greatest gift he could have provided: the motivation to discover exactly how strong and capable I really was. The story of how my husband abandoned me during labor and stole our money to fund his affair had become the foundation for a new narrative about resilience, empowerment, and the unexpected opportunities that can emerge from life's darkest moments. Emily would grow up knowing that her mother had faced betrayal and chose to transform it into triumph, that she had been underestimated and responded by exceeding everyone's expectations, including her own. Marcus had thought he was ending our story when he sent that text message while I was bringing his daughter into the world. But what he had actually done was begin a new chapter where I was the author, where his betrayal became the catalyst for my transformation, and where his attempt to diminish me became the foundation for accomplishments he never could have imagined possible. The woman who had trusted blindly and loved unconditionally was gone, but in her place was someone stronger, wiser, and more determined than ever before. Emily and I were building a future that was more secure and more meaningful than anything we could have achieved with someone who would prioritize his selfish desires over his family's well-being. Sometimes the people who hurt you the most end up teaching you the most valuable lessons about your own strength and potential. Marcus had intended to break me, but he had actually shown me exactly how unbreakable I could be. And for that unexpected gift, I would always be grateful, even as I continued building the extraordinary life that his betrayal had made possible. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.